Hello everyone, welcome to the latest in our video series. Today we're going to be talking about the latest trends and developments in data protection across Asia over the end of 2023 and going into 2024. My name is Carolyn Bigg. I'm one of the global co-chairs of the Data, Privacy and Cyber subgroup at DLA Piper. I'm a partner and I'm based in Hong Kong. I've been a data lawyer for over 20 years and I've been based in Asia for 15 years now. And I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague, Venus. Venus, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure, thanks, Carolyn. Hi, I'm Venus Cheung. I'm a senior associate in Carolyn's team, and I work on a lot of data protection matters for the past few years, especially with the focus on APAC jurisdictions.
Thanks, Venus. So we're really excited to be here to talk to you today, not least because, as one of my colleagues always says, Asia's where the cool stuff happens. And that's really true, not only when it comes to technology and AI and data analytics, the opportunities are there to do more with data here, but also because we have this fast evolving regulatory landscape. And really, it's really hard to, sometimes it feels really hard to keep track of all the regulatory developments when it comes to data law. So we're going to just introduce a few key themes today. What we just really wanted to say, and is maybe if you've seen our recently updated Data Protection Laws of the World Handbook, we have a heat map on the front page of that. And it should be pretty clear from that heat map that actually we don't have one harmonized data protection framework across Asia. All of the different laws have evolved over time at different paces and for different reasons. And so we absolutely do not have the equivalent of a GDPR here in Asia. I'd say it's probably true now to say that pretty much every jurisdiction across Asia has a data protection law now, increasingly an omnibus comprehensive data privacy law, not just industry specific laws. But even within that, we're seeing lots of developments still, new important laws coming for some important jurisdictions this year, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. Really, the theme of today is going to be around 4 C's. The first C is consent. Secondly, cross-border data transfers, everyone's favorite topic in this part of the world. Thirdly, cyber and how cyber incidents are managed and responded to here. And fourthly, class actions, and really to focus on those differences in enforcement and the different risks to manage when it comes to data in Asia. So let's start, we'll go into the first one of those C's, Venus. Let's start with cross-border data transfers. I think that's probably the key theme in 2023, and I think it's going to carry on into 2024. So maybe you just want to talk about some of the challenges and the opportunities around cross-border data transfers in Asia.
Sure. So as Carolyn mentioned, there's currently no harmonization of the laws in Asia generally, and then there are lots of new data laws that came in over the last year, and we anticipate more to come in this year and also in the future. So basically on cross-border data transfers, there has been lots of discussions and lots of new requirements in the past year, particularly for China and Vietnam. The new laws introduce a very comprehensive approval and submission process, which a lot of companies are struggling at the moment to prepare for it, and also to make sure that their cross-border data transfer activities will continue as usual. So the main focus around all these approvals and submissions are around your data mapping and also the actual data activities that you're conducting within your company. So a very first suggestion to all companies to make sure that you have your data mapping done nice and clear. And then we're also anticipating more other jurisdictions might join the crowd to go with similar approaches. For example, Indonesia seems to be asking for approval from the regulators prior to cross-border data transfers, and we see similarly in Saudi and also other jurisdictions might be moving towards the same trend.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think we get a lot of misunderstanding, misperceptions that certain data from certain parts of Asia, particularly China and Vietnam, that data just can't cross the border. So from what you're saying, it's more a question of compliance steps, whether that's actually going and getting approvals or consent or certain filings. Is that right?
Yes, so I think it's also a very good opportunity for organizations to streamline their approach in managing data as well as knowing what your business is doing and using data for. So that's definitely the trend from the regulator perspective, like regulatory perspective, but it's also an opportunity for organizations that could use more of their data and also to better plan how they utilize their data. As long as they, of course, like keep all the compliance steps done.
Yeah, I think that's certainly my experience as well. And what you said at the beginning, I hope that's one of the key takeaways from our discussion today is that mapping your data, understanding those data flows are really critical. So take a jurisdiction like China, where, as you say, actually it might be an approval, it might be a filing, it might not be either. And there are it's well publicized that there's some potential exemptions, fingers crossed, coming for China, but there are still pockets of data, not just personal data, um, that has to stay in China, but they're quite small. And it's really understanding the data flows, who the data controller is, what the data is, volumes of data. Same for Vietnam, to really then be able to understand your compliance obligations.
Yeah, I think in addition, it's also a lot about like putting good relationship with your vendors and your customers, because at some point you might also need to speak to them and also obtain information around like all these data processing activities. So it's quite important to have a very full-scale data mapping done, like to make sure that you can keep up with like these trends.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And I think also just the starting point, we said there's no harmonization of data laws across Asia. It's not GDPR, so maybe leave those GDPR mindset at the door when you come to Asia and think about data here. Don't just assume that something like standard contractual clauses or doing transfer impact assessments will help. You may need to do privacy impact assessments. You may have local versions of standard contractual clauses, but you may need to get consent. You may need to get a regulatory approval or filing. And so don't just assume that it's the same around the world. I talked about consent there, Venus, and I just wanted to come back to that point. It was my second C. Um, Consent, we hear again, we get a lot of questions from clients and within our peer group here in Asia. What does is consent really that important still in Asia? And what about those challenges? People with again a European mindset about consent. Is it valid consent? So maybe just explain a bit about consent really is still critical, isn't it?
Sure, yes. So definitely consent is still the number one thing to do in Asia. Almost all the Asia jurisdictions would still require consent in order to collection like or do any processing as well as of course cross-border data transfers. The challenge or the difficulty in it is to make sure that your consent language is valid and also fulfills the requisite requirements. Unlike GDPR, there usually isn't really a legitimate interest base for you to rely upon. So consent still becomes like the king. It's still the king in Asia, which you need to make sure like the consents collected in different scenarios is sufficient enough, and also how do you keep the consents, making sure the consents are like obtained in the right format, in the right language. So I think the biggest challenge for companies in Asia is to have different like to streamline their consent language, which is something that we usually see a lot of companies might be struggling with because of the different requirements. So that's one to watch as well.
Yeah, I mean, we see. I mean, Korea's always been challenging with its consent language, sort of often a page and a half of consent language. China now, you can often end up with maybe three or four different clicks or ticks to get consent. And Vietnam, I think, is quite challenging now as well. And there are others. And it quite can be quite challenging, again, coming from a European or a US background, to understand that this is really critical. Maybe one of the other things you could just touch on, Venus, is actually those consent channels, those data collection channels. And maybe people just automatically go to, well, how do we do this on a website? But actually, an easier culturally, sorry, in Asia, it can sometimes be easier culturally to get consent because perhaps it's focusing on mobile apps.
Yeah, exactly. I think the general trend or for Asia, usually people are more familiar with like the concept of consent. So usually in any apps or any websites, when people are asked to provide their consent, they would usually take the boxes as required. Unlike some other jurisdictions, the level, like the condition to obtain consent sometimes might not be as strict. So sometimes you can actually get all these consents from the data subjects or the individuals before they proceed to the next step. So that's also one thing that it's permissible in many of these Asia like jurisdictions, which makes consent a bit easier to obtain sometimes in practice.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the fundamental differences. And I think we are seeing an increasing regionalization of data culture, data practices. While a law might look the same around the world, and certainly, the kind of data protection key principles, things like data security, data retention, accuracy, those sorts of things, necessity. Um, Actually, I think another key theme we're trying to sort of emphasize today is that actually, while it might look the same, um, if you go back to how that law is, perhaps look at the original language, not just an English translation, but how a regulator might interpret or apply or enforce a law actually can be very different in practice on the ground. And I think that consent part is one of those areas, one of those pieces. Um, Data in Asia is not based on a fundamental absolute right to a private life as GDPR and European data law has grown up from. Um, it's not like the US, sort of the driver behind US data privacy law in recent years, which has been that fear of social media and their data collection activities. Data in Asia is very much based on data is an asset. There is an element of consumer protection and trying to stop the worst abuse of data. But data is an asset, and individuals can choose whether or not they share it, and they are willing to do so in return for something like a more personalized or tailored experience or convenience. That's a big thing here, and particularly when it comes to mobile apps, which is the primary way of communicating and transacting in Asia. And so, just that understanding of culture and drivers for data protection law, there still has to be a compliant framework, but just understanding what that means in practice on the ground is really important. I just wanted to move slightly to one of the other C's, which was cyber. Now, we have been working on cyber incidents in Asia and with colleagues across wider Asia Pacific region in the last 12 months. And obviously, cyber incidents are not going to go away. They're gonna keep happening, and the incidents we see here in Asia are pretty similar to those you see elsewhere in the world in terms of ransomware attacks and individual, just human error, same sort of incidents. But what's been really interesting is seeing how the regulators have responded to that. And we still see the industry regulators having a really great part at actually enforcing that on the ground. Countries like particularly Australia in the broader APAC region, but particularly Singapore, are now being much more responsive and almost proactive about managing data security incidents. So cyber is going to be one where, given some really big incidents across APAC in the last 12 months, but also if you go back in the last decade, it's really important, not only because regulators are becoming more aware and fines are getting bigger. We're seeing as laws across Asia are being updated, those fines are increasing, but also consumer awareness is growing, particularly in Australia. They've had those big incidents recently, Singapore before that. I'd say Japan is one really to watch with data security and data breach notifications. It's becoming increasingly aware that you pretty much have to notify every incident in Japan. And India is particularly challenging at the moment under their cyber laws rather than their data laws. Again, having to report virtually every incident that just touches on India and having to do that very quickly. So while there are some jurisdictions around Asia that perhaps breach notification is not so much of a priority, the regulators are perhaps less resourced or less sophisticated or aware of or able to manage cyber notifications. There are some pockets around Asia where the jurisdictions where this is an increasingly important issue. So that's probably the third C to keep in mind over the coming 12 months. Um, Venus, we've got some new laws coming in Asia Pacific or across Asia in the next 12 months. What do you think is the most important one of those, do you think, for our clients and that we're going to be talking about the most in the next 12 months?
I think Indonesia would be one to watch because of the grace period being ending quite soon, like this and by the end of the year. I think like Indonesia and Vietnam would be the two main ones for Asia in the coming year. Well, without forgetting China, because it's changing and it's developing. A lot of things are evolving. But at the moment, I think that's the main one to look at. What do you
Agree.
think?
No, I agree. I think Indonesia is going to be important. It's going to be challenging. There's a culture of data law in Indonesia. They've had these laws that are old. They've not had an omnibus comprehensive data law. So this new law, when it comes into force, full force later this year, I think it's going to be challenging given the size of Indonesia to implement and roll these things out. But maybe the elephant in the room, the one we haven't talked about yet, is India. India is going to the law, thankfully, is stepped back from the brink of being the really challenging, all-encompassing data law, not just data privacy. It is a personal data protection law, and they've stepped back from the brink of strict data localization, which, after years of lobbying, I think a lot of people have breathed a sigh of relief about. But it's a very sensible law. It's learned from a lot of laws around the world. It seems quite relatively straightforward as these things go. But the real challenge for India is going to be there are some local nuances, there are some additional steps you're going to have to take to really deal with local sensitivities. And I think probably the biggest challenge is just going to be implementing that law in such a vast country, which it's had the IT Act, but it hasn't had an overarching data privacy law. So we're hearing a lot of conversations and chat about length of time it's going to take to roll out an India data protection law compliance program over this coming year. And slightly outside the region, but I think Saudi Arabia is the other one that's getting that chatter, I suppose, as well. We can't forget, as you mentioned, there's going to be updates to existing laws. You mentioned China. Malaysia is looking at updating its law. It's quite old now. It's sort of over 12 years old now. It been enforced. Australia, we know from colleagues down there who perhaps will join one of these videos in the coming months, but there's a vast change of law or sort of updates to law, particularly in light of recent data security incidents coming. And that's been a real trend over the years. Big data security incidents, big upgrade to a law within months or years afterwards. So Australia is going to be one to watch. And then I think the other area that we've seen in Europe is Europe's got these, AI laws, but also a Data Act coming in, looking at broader data categories, not just privacy law. And I think we've always had that in Asia. In China, it's particularly well known that it's not just personal data, but other categories of data that are regulated. And I think we're going to increasingly see that trend continue as we see that grow in places like Europe now as well. And just to really sort of close off the conversation, I'll go to my fourth C, which class actions, but I think the broader topic is the enforcement piece, those practical risks. Coming back to what does that actually mean? What does compliance actually require? And we talk about data risk now as not just a compliance risk. We talked about it as an operational resiliency risk and a commercial strategic risk, loss of opportunity to do things like AI and data analytics. But when people are looking at data risks, particularly if they're looking at contractual or commercial arrangements, they tend to distill it down to what's the risk of a fine? What's the fine? And what's the actual enforcement risk? And it's definitely true that in Asia in the last 12 months, and we'll see this continuing this year, fines are getting bigger in terms of the percentage of turnover for non-compliance with the data privacy law. But it's not the same. In reality, it's not been the same as the big fines you see in Europe. And it's just a different risk to manage. So we are beginning to see class actions. As I mentioned, that's particularly the case in Australia now. There is now, that's probably the biggest risk that that those of you in the US have to manage is that class action risk rather than the fines risk. And that's coming to Asia Pacific now as well. But perhaps the biggest risk in Asia still remains those operational and contractual risks. The regulators will just switch off your site, take down your app off an app store, or go in and do a big investigation on site with you to help you get to compliance. And those operational costs, the loss of business if your system's blocked, that's just a different risk to quantify, and that probably is the biggest risk. And if you're a vendor or a service provider, that knock-on risk of your contractual arrangements, what contractual liabilities, it's going to be really difficult. I think it is difficult to say, make a contractual assurance, we comply with all data protection laws or all applicable data protection laws. When in Asia, as you've heard, the laws are constantly evolving and they're not harmonized, and they may not be the same as you're used to perhaps in North America or Europe or elsewhere in the world. So I think it's that real understanding of what do the regulators prioritize when it comes to enforcement? How do they interpret the laws? How will they apply them? What are their key enforcement priorities for the coming year? Is the fine risk actually in reality a real risk, or is it actually those operational or even class action risks that you need to be quantifying and building in when you're looking at things like limitations of liability clauses and indemnities and DPAs? So that's a really broad canter, really quick canter through a very big region and a very big set of data protection laws, a big data framework. Venus, just to close, I just wanted to ask you what your closing thoughts are, what people should be paying attention to, what the priorities are for the coming 12 months.
Sure. I think the biggest takeaway that I have here is these requirements and all everything around data compliance applies to all big and small companies. There's not much exemptions around how big or how small your presence is in these jurisdictions. So you need to be careful that it will apply to you. And as Carolyn, you mentioned, the most important thing is around like enforcement operationally. How would that affect your company? Another big takeaway is that data is no longer and it's not really only a data thing, but it also extends to your operation, your infrastructure, as well as your opportunities in Asia. So that's definitely something you need to consider when mapping your full operation exercise rather than just focusing on like one thing.
I couldn't agree more. And I guess my final closing thought is to go back to what we started with. Cross-border data transfers are going to remain challenging, but it's not impossible. You can navigate through them. It just takes planning. So know your data, map your data and your data flows. And most importantly, don't forget that consent. Don't disregard it. That's going to be critical. Venus, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you all again soon for our next video. Thank you.
Thank you.